In mainstream discourse, feminism is often treated as one united monolithic whole that represents the ideology of the women's movement in its entirety. Such thinking presents rich, upper-class, white women and the imperial core as having the same fundamental interests as working-class women in the global south. The business-owning capitalist woman somehow united with the proletarian women she exploits. Cuban women would somehow feel liberated if Hillary Clinton was spearheading the genocidal embargo against their country instead of a man like Donald Trump or Joe Biden. A monumental victory for feminism. Of course, this is nonsense. The, quote, feminism, unquote, of Hillary Clinton is diametrically opposed to the feminism of working class, cis women, and queer people because the maximization of Hillary Clinton's freedom as a bourgeois cis woman can only be achieved off the backs of the working and oppressed masses of the global south.
In reality, far from feminism being one united monolithic whole, there are multiple contending feminisms, each with drastically differing political goals and aspirations. In feminism, three fundamental tendencies can be distinguished, three substantive colours: bourgeois feminism, petty-bourgeois feminism, and proletarian feminism. Each one of these feminisms formulates its own demands in a different way. The bourgeois woman unites feminism with the interests of the conservative class. The proletarian woman unifies her feminism with the faith of the revolutionary multitudes in the society of the future. The class struggle, a historical fact and not merely a theoretical assertion, is reflected on the feminist stage. Women, like men, are reactionaries, centrists, or revolutionaries. They cannot, consequently, all fight the same battle side by side. So in today's video, Anna and I will be given a brief introduction to the proletarian movement against patriarchal oppression, its history, ideological underpinnings, how it differs from other strands of feminism, as well as considering what this all means for real-world organising.
Feminism broadly, as a movement aimed at elevating the positions of those oppressed by patriarchal society, has existed self-consciously for hundreds of years. The 1700s and 1800s stand as critical periods in the development of what we now call liberal feminist thought, witnessing the emergence of key figures in the articulation of foundational ideas that would shape the trajectory of the broad movement against patriarchy. In the latter part of the 18th century, Mary Wollstonecraft emerged as a pivotal figure in the inception of feminist philosophy. Her seminal work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792, challenged prevailing societal norms by advocating for women's education and empowerment. Wollstonecraft argued vehemently against the perceived inherent inferiority of women, laying the groundwork for later feminist thinkers. Simultaneously, in revolutionary France, Olympe de Gouges boldly responded to the tumultuous political climate with her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen in 1791, demanding equal rights for women and drawing attention to the exclusion of women from political processes during the French Revolution. While important and historically progressive for this time and place, the most prominent feminist figures of this time were generally white bourgeois European or Euro descendant cis women. Activists like Sojourner Truth, however, born into chattel slavery in New York in 1797, quickly emerged to provide a non-white, non-bourgeois feminist perspective, with her famous Ain't I a Woman speech in 1851, emphasizing the important intersection of oppression experienced not only through gender, but also through race and class.
Around the same time, the international workers' movement was emerging in response to the intensifying development of industrial capitalism in the late 18th and early 19th century. At the spearhead of this struggle, Friedrich Engels would become an important theorist in understanding patriarchal oppression through the lens of class society using the historical materialist framework. This scientific analysis was exemplified in his landmark work, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State in 1884, which charts out the transition from matriarchal pre-class society to patriarchal class society, providing the crucial insight for feminism that the emergence of private property was the basis for patriarchal oppression. meaning the only way to fully uproot and destroy patriarchy would be to abolish private property and end class society itself. While certain aspects of this analysis have had to be updated in line with modern scientific understandings of humanity's historical development, the core findings of Engels' work have been confirmed in the more recent academic work of anthropologists like Eleanor Burke-Leacock and Christine Ward-Gailey. The workers' movement internationally continued to make theoretical and practical inroads into the struggle against patriarchy over the course of the 20th century. Notably, Alexandra Kollontai, a Russian Marxist who participated in the Bolshevik Revolution, would build upon Engels' findings and provide scathing criticism of the then mainstream feminist movement's focus on the interests solely of bourgeois women at the expense of working women, in her 1909 landmark work, The Social Basis of the Woman Question. In it, Kollontai drew important lines of demarcation within the anti-patriarchal movement by asserting that the women's world is divided, just as is the world of men, into two camps. The interests and aspirations of one group bring it close to the bourgeois class, while the other group has close connections to the proletariat, and its claim for liberation encompass a full solution to the woman question. Thus, although both camps follow the general slogan of the liberation of women, their aims and interests are different. Each of the groups unconsciously takes its starting point from the interests and aspirations of its own class, which gives a specific class colouring to the targets and tasks it sets for itself.
Similarly, the German Marxist theorist who founded International Women's Day, Clara Zetkin, would go on to make further explications in the 1920s in her two-part work, Lenin on the Women's Question. As would the Trinidadian-born black nationalist and member of the Communist Party of the United States, Claudia Jones, in her 1949 work, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman, in which she gave a Marxist analysis of the particular class-based oppression faced by black proletarian women, otherwise known as misogynoir. The bourgeoisie is fearful of the militancy of the Negro woman, and for good reason. The capitalists know, far better than any progressives seem to know, that once Negro women begin to take action, the militancy of the whole Negro people, and thus of the anti-imperialist coalition, is greatly enhanced. Viewed in this light, it is not accidental that the American bourgeoisie have intensified its own oppression, not only of the Negro people in general, but of Negro women in particular. Nothing so exposes the drive to fascization in the nation as the calloused attitude which the bourgeoisie displays and cultivates towards Negro women. While agreeing with the essence or content of the struggle against patriarchy, supporting women's liberation, the workers' movement generally treated the term feminism with suspicion at this time, due to the movement at the time primarily representing the interests of a minority of upper-class white women in the imperial core. The Peruvian Marxist philosopher José Carlos Mariátegui, however, would correctly come to identify the different class standpoints in the movement against patriarchy, whether bourgeois, petty-bourgeois, or proletarian. It's from Mariátegui's 1924 text, Feminist Demands, that we get the term proletarian feminism itself, a term which, as we'll come to see, is still debated to this day. But this is an issue of form rather than content, focusing on the cover of the book rather than the content of that book. For now, we'll focus on the content. Moving forward to the second half of the 20th century, upholding the content of Mariátegui's teachings, Catalina Adriazen and the Peruvian Movimiento Femenino Popular released perhaps the most comprehensively fleshed out work on the matter to date, Marxism, Mariátegui, and the Women's Movement in 1974. This played an enormously important role in providing the concrete ideological position on the struggle against patriarchy for revolutionary Marxist organizations worldwide, including the movements in Peru, India, and Nepal. Revolutionary movements continue to make further developments upon proletarian anti-patriarchal theory through revolutionary practice in the 1990s and 2000s, particularly spearheaded by revolutionaries like Anuradha Gandhi in India, as well as former revolutionaries like Kisila Yami in Nepal.
Importantly, growing alongside what's hitherto been called the women's movement, since the mid-20th century has been the movement for queer liberation, which also seeks the abolition of patriarchal oppression.
Darling, I want my gay rights now! I think it's about time the gay brothers and sisters got their rights! And especially the women!
Alongside the important practice led by black and brown radical queer liberationists in the US like Marsha P. Johnson, the queer liberation movement has also produced important theoretical work like Toward a Scientific Analysis of the Gay Question from the Los Angeles Research Group in 1974, which was a scathing criticism of queer antagonism within the socialist movement at that time, and which helped to concretize a firm scientific basis for understanding the patriarchal oppression of queers using the historical materialist methods. It's now becoming understood that these two currents, the struggle for the liberation of cis women on one hand and the struggle for the liberation of queers on the other, are two sides of the same coin, both fighting for freedom from patriarchal oppression rooted in private property, and both playing an equally important role in what we today call proletarian feminism. To this day, socialist revolutionaries are at the forefront of fighting for queer liberation and cis women's liberation from patriarchal oppression. For example, in the Philippines, where the CPP-MPA have been facilitating queer marriages in their liberated base areas since 2005. Meanwhile, nearly 20 years on, queer marriage still remains illegal under the reactionary Philippine old state headed by Bongbong Marcos.
The gay must be militant with serving the people.
So with this history in mind, it's now worth asking, what is proletarian feminism exactly? Simply put, proletarian feminism is the standpoint of the working class and oppressed masses in the struggle against patriarchy, understanding that the struggle against patriarchy is necessarily the struggle against class society and private property. But then we need to ask, what exactly is patriarchy? Patriarchy is a mode of oppression mainly targeting cis women and queer people that has spanned across all forms of class society from slave society through feudalism and up to the modern day in capitalism. Patriarchal oppression is visible in virtually all aspects of society's superstructure, from the family, our systems of law, our cultures, and so on. Patriarchy ensures that cis men hold disproportionate power and privilege over cis women, and makes it so that members of class society are divided and assigned different roles depending on what their gender is. Those who play the role of men must be the breadwinners, the head of their family, the leaders of society. Meanwhile, those who play the role of women are relegated to domestic help, the bearer of children, and the supporting roles to men. But why does this exist? What role does this mode of oppression serve in society? A general rule of thumb to keep in mind about class societies: if a form of oppression doesn't benefit the ruling class in some way, it wouldn't exist under class society or be promoted by the ruling class. Patriarchal subjugation materially serves the interests of the ruling class. In addition to profiting off of their exploitation as workers, the ruling class profits off cis women and queer people's subordination by patriarchy in many different ways. For example, proletarian cis women are seen by the ruling class as factories for future laborers, and bourgeois cis women are factories for future heirs. Additionally, queer people are forced into this rigid gender binary in order to force them to fulfill the role they need to play in this production and reproduction. Cis women and queer people, and in recent years particularly trans women, are seen as sexual products to be bought and sold on the sex market. One of the earliest forms of slavery, of course, was sexual slavery. Cis women are subjugated into the wife-mother role in order to rear workers through their uncompensated domestic labor, ensuring the capitalist system receives a steady supply of labor power. Queer women or trans men who do not adhere to this gender role forced upon them are shunned by society and/or are subjected to queer-phobic violence.
Now, these are just some of the particularities of why patriarchy exists, its effects, and its purpose. But in a general sense, it can be summarised that patriarchy exists to facilitate the accumulation of private property. Specifically, its accumulation across generations. And this is borne out historically. Patriarchy and its corresponding oppression of cis-women and queers began during the transition period between primitive communal society and class society. In The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Engels refers to these three periods as 1. Savagery, which is primitive communist hunter-gatherer society, 2. Barbarism, which is the transitional stage, introducing pastoralism and agriculture, and 3. Civilization, which is class society beginning with slave society, then feudalism, then capitalism. Corresponding to each of these three stages is a different form of marriage between people and groups of people. In primitive communist savagery, group marriage among and between large groups of people is the norm. There was no generalized form of patriarchy at this stage. No prohibitions between who could and couldn't have relations with one another. In barbarism, the transitional stage between primitive communism and class society, there's a move away from group marriage and now pairing marriage begins. This is the point historically where patriarchy truly begins to emerge. Engels states that, in this stage, one man lives with one woman, but the relationship is such that polygamy and occasional infidelity remain the right of the men, even though for economic reasons polygamy is rare. While from the woman, the strictest fidelity is generally demanded throughout the time she lives with the man, and adultery on her part is cruelly punished. The marriage tie can, however, be easily dissolved by either partner. After separation, the children still belong, as before, to the mother alone.
Note the last part about children belonging to the mother when separation occurs. This is a remnant from primitive communism when people would have multiple sexual partners. This made it often impossible to tell who the biological father of the child was, and this wasn't a concern in communal environment anyway, as children were raised collectively. The only thing that could be certain here was that the mother gave birth to the child. Therefore, the mother was afforded what is sometimes referred to as mother right, due to the definite biological connection there. Kinship was consequently traced through the mother's line, matrilineage, rather than the father's, and women held higher position in society as a result. This mother right remained in the pairing marriages of barbarism, as primitive communism's group marriages slowly died out.
But something changed during barbarism as class society began to emerge. With the pairing marriage, there was a move away from communal ownership of property and instead towards private ownership. Pastoralism and agriculture developed, which began to produce a surplus that was no longer held collectively. With this, a division of labour emerged wherein it was the man's part to obtain food and the instruments of labour necessary for the purpose. He therefore also owned the instruments of labour, and in the event of husband and wife separating, he took them with him, just as she retained her household goods. Therefore, according to the social custom of the time, the man was also the owner of the new source of subsistence, the cattle, and later on the new instruments of labour, the slaves. But according to the custom of the same society, his children could not inherit from him. So cattle were breeding and wealth was growing relatively rapidly, far beyond the needs of those in the households. This made it possible for some to take slaves, specifically to feed this new class of labourers and keep them alive indefinitely. Slaves had children and a slave labour force grew. With more food, more cattle and more slaves, with the rise of this new surplus, cis men in particular grew wealthier and their position within the family became more and more important. But while the matrilineal mother right remained, there was no way for him to pass on his private property to the next generation. What was to become of his slaves, his cattle and so on after he died? Inheritance occurred almost exclusively along the mother's lines. The only way for this private property to be passed down to the cis man's biological children to continue to accumulate was if mother right was overthrown, and in its place was put a patrilineal system that heavily restricted everyone other than cis men's freedoms, and introduced what we would now identify as patriarchal oppression. This would facilitate inheritance based on the cis-male line and allow the accumulation of private property to span across generations, eventually flourishing into full empires. And so, that's precisely what happens. The overthrow of mother rights was the world historical defeat of the female sex. The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. The patriarchal family was thus born, having successfully subjugated cis-women, and with them all of those who didn't neatly fit into this patriarchal order, who we now refer to broadly as queers. In order to ensure that the children who would inherit the property were biologically connected to the father, the pairing marriage now transformed into the monogamous marriage. This brings us to the beginning of class society, from barbarism to the beginnings of civilization. A civilization which was of course slave society. The monogamous marriage is based on the supremacy of the man, the express purpose being to produce children of undisputed paternity. Such paternity is demanded because these children are later to come into their father's property as his natural heirs. It is distinguished from pairing marriage by the much greater strength of the marriage tie, which can no longer be dissolved at either partner's wish. As a rule, it is now only the man who can dissolve it and put away his wife.
This monogamous marriage, the permanent patriarchal form which facilitates the accumulation of property, is seen clearly in ancient Greek slave society, developing in intensity and becoming more and more generalized geographically as the centuries pass. And this, of course, could only be facilitated and generalized with the development of the slave state, which enforced private property relations and cis-male supremacy, violently punishing all those who challenged it in any way. And this continued with the feudal state, and continues today with the capitalist state, each form of state, of course, manifesting with its own unique characteristics. Patriarchy and the patriarchal family exist to this day to facilitate inheritance and the accumulation of capital across generations, as well as the reproduction of labor. In other words, to protect and grow private property, and to ensure that people are able to labor with that private property in order to further accumulate capital for the ruling class. Anyone who impedes this process is punished accordingly, and the two groups that are incentivized most to do this, the two groups whose freedom is inherently at odds with this state of affairs, are cis-women and queer people.
So today we've traced a particular strand in the movement against patriarchy, the strand which we would now call Proletarian Feminism, its history and its theoretical basis. However, there are of course many feminisms reflecting different class interests, including Petty-Bourgeois and Bourgeois. And across these different feminisms of different class standpoints are numerous shades within them, from first wave, second wave, third wave, and fourth wave feminism, each with various overlapping inflections and emphases on different matters, such as black feminism and ecofeminism, as well as more recent umbrella groupings like intersectional feminism. While it's far beyond the scope of this video to examine each and every single shade that's ever existed within the feminist movement, we will briefly attempt to raise some of the limitations with bourgeois and petty-bourgeois feminism so that it can become clearer why it's necessary to uphold a specifically proletarian or working class feminism.
So, first of all, what's the problem with bourgeois feminism? Bourgeois feminism begins from the standpoint of the upper-class white cis woman in the imperial core. The political task of bourgeois feminism is to make life as comfortable and free as possible for this specific 0.1% of women, so that their individual experience is on par with the experience of bourgeois imperialist cis men. This, of course, functions to the exclusion of the overwhelming majority of working class and oppressed cis women and queers of the world. Indeed, it can be said that liberal feminism's primary goal is to gain upper-class cis women the same powers to exploit that are enjoyed by upper-class cis men, equality between bourgeois cis men and bourgeois cis women in the exploitation of the workers of the world, a fairer share of the loot dished out to all the members of the capitalist upper class. This historically took the form of advocating for formal legal rights for individual cis women through reform, such as seen in the suffrage movement. Of course, liberal feminism played a historically progressive role at a specific moment in time by combating prevailing feudal patriarchal ideas in the 1700s and early 1800s. Just as liberalism itself was initially a progressive ideology against the previous feudal order. But at today's stage of consolidated capitalism and bourgeois rule, this has become historically obsolete, and indeed even conservative, for the current order of class society. To summarize the mentality of bourgeois feminism, when confronted with the fact that the world's 8 richest people, who are all cis white men, have as much wealth as the poorest half of the world, the bourgeois feminist solution to this disparity would be for the 8 richest people to instead be 50% cis white men and 50% cis white women. Problem solved. For upper class cis white women anyway. In the simplest terms, bourgeois feminism's demands require the continuation of class society, even though the very existence of class society, as we've explained, is the root of women's subordination. And while the continuation of class society is the only way for these bourgeois women to achieve their desired individualist version of, quote, female self-empowerment, unquote, the continuation of capitalism also means the continuation of Jeffrey Epstein's, Prince Andrew's, and Andrew Tate's of the world. The continued existence of class society will mean the continued existence of men like the pigs that conducted the Mahmoudiyya rape and killings in Iraq against a 14-year-old girl and her family. It will mean the continuation of the murder and sexual abuse of women like Jennifer Laude by soldiers stationed in the global south to maintain Western imperial control over different parts of the world. Bourgeois women's empowerment through the means of private property rights comes at the expense of the continuation of misogynist violence against the majority of women across the world.
Moving on to petty-bourgeois feminism now. What's commonly referred to as radical feminism, or radfem, used to be the dominant trend of middle-class feminism during the second wave. Though today, intersectional feminism has risen to greatest prominence among this class. Radical feminism was enormously popular in the 1960s and 70s in Western countries, as it struck a revolutionary pose at a time when more and more young people were becoming increasingly radicalized by intensifying imperialist aggression globally, a rising wave of militant national liberation struggles, and the general struggle against decaying capitalist society. However, as Women's Liberation Front co-founder Devra Weber explained, the radical feminists were opposed to patriarchy, but not necessarily capitalism. In our group at least, they opposed so-called male-dominated national liberation struggles. Here we see the decisive class interests of the privileged middle-class white cis women of the imperial core in action. The struggle against class society is pushed aside. The struggles of the working class and oppressed masses around the world ignored, and instead given primary importance is collaboration with white bourgeois cis women in pursuit of an ill-conceived class collaborationist pseudo-revolutionism. Those who've been studying Marxism for a while now will know that this kind of class collaborationist pseudo-revolutionism is a hallmark of reactionary ideology, up to and including fascism itself. Revolutionary in form, reactionary in content. So how does so-called radical feminism manage to go so far astray? One of the key issues present in radfem, which gives rise to an array of further problems, is the mistaken belief that biological sex is the root cause of patriarchal oppression. That the primary contradiction is between cis men and cis women purely due to biological differences. And that these biological differences constitute what prominent radical feminist theorists like Shulamith Firestone would describe as biological sex classes. However, this belief is ahistorical and falls apart completely when we consider the fact that for over 95% of humanity's existence, patriarchy didn't exist, nor did class, or indeed sex class as Firestone would put it. The same biological differences existed, but there was no patriarchal oppression in matriarchal pre-class communal societies. So patriarchy can't be explained as being rooted simply in biological differences. In this sense, radical feminism is not radical at all, as it doesn't correctly identify the root cause of patriarchal oppression. So what changed between the non-patriarchal pre-class societies and later patriarchal class societies that so drastically subordinated cis-women and queers? What is the root cause of patriarchal oppression? Private property. Private property emerged immediately before patriarchy. Private property and its accumulation through agriculture and pastoralism came first. Then came the realization that people who can give birth would be able to facilitate the further intergenerational accumulation of private property. So the continued accumulation of private property from the surplus generated by agriculture and pastoralism, which had already begun, led to the oppression of cis-women and queers in the first instance. If there was no private property to pass on to children, then there would have been no reason for the overthrow of mother rights and the subordination of cis-women and queers. No basis for patriarchal oppression and its particular division of labour. So the oppression of cis-women and queers was nothing other than the logical extension of the process of accumulation of private property. Cis-women and queers had to be subordinate and under cis-men's control so as to ensure that he had children that were biologically his, in order to pass on his private property to after he died. And what we now call queer relations had to be viciously repressed as they posed a threat to a father having that biological heir who would inherit his private property. Without this clear understanding of the basis of patriarchal oppression, and instead relying upon an ahistorical idealist bioessentialism, petty-bourgeois radfems will often fall into the trap of queer antagonism in general and transphobia in particular. Hence the right-wing phenomenon of TERFs, or trans-exclusionary radical feminists. And it's also worth highlighting just how reactionary and revisionist this concept of sex class truly is. It might seem somewhat innocuous at first, but following the idea of women being a separate class to men to its logical conclusion necessarily leads to the rejection of historical materialism. If biological differences are the determining factor in differentiating classes, or sex classes, then there's never been classless society, and there never can be classless society. In other words, there can be no genuine liberation from the oppression of class society. And chiefly within that, no liberation from patriarchal oppression. Liberation becomes an impossibility. Instead, the cis-woman worker and her cis-woman capitalist boss who exploits her both become united in their sex class, which is of course class collaborationism. And the only supposed class struggle to be found is pseudo-class struggle against the opposing sex class of cis-men, be they worker or capitalists. So in other words, this reactionary ideology inherently pits workers against workers and calls itself class struggle. This is complete revisionism, and its inevitable result is the disunity of the working class and oppressed masses and the strengthening of the most oppressive elements of class society, including patriarchy itself. There's precisely nothing radical about radical feminism. It's a right-wing deviation that holds no liberatory potential whatsoever for anyone oppressed by patriarchy.
On the more progressive center-left end of petty-bourgeois feminism, thankfully, is intersectional feminism. Correcting many of the issues with earlier bourgeois feminism, intersectional feminism recalibrates its focus from the interest primarily of upper-class white cis women and following the path of Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman, which examined the intersection of race, class, and gender in the 1850s, intersectional feminism instead considers multiple vectors of oppression and how these all intersect with one another. Gender, ethnicity, race, class, sexuality, religion, ability, caste, culture, and more are all considered as valid, equal sources of oppression, and depending on where one stands in relation to these sources of privilege. Its formal creation is often attributed to Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, who argued the importance of legal institutions considering multiple, intersecting sources of discrimination at a time and place where only one such source of discrimination would be considered. For example, one regularly highlighted case would be someone being denied a job for being a Black cis woman. Prior to this legal intervention, discrimination could only be recognized on one axis. She was either discriminated against for being Black, racism, or she was discriminated against for being a cis woman, sexism. It was impossible to consider the real combination of racism and sexism working hand in hand in this earlier framework. So in this sense, the intervention of intersectionality marked a progressive step forward in meeting the daily demands of the working class and oppressed masses. However, from a historical materialist perspective, we go a step further beyond this and discover certain limitations of intersectional feminism. While intersectional feminism can do a decent but not perfect job at combating the negative effects of many different forms of oppression and discrimination, in its commitment to treat all forms of oppression as equal, it finds itself only able to deal with the effects of these modes of oppression and never with their root causes. It can only treat symptoms, never cure the disease. The reason for this is that any thorough historical analysis of where these various modes of oppression come from, such as white supremacy and patriarchy, points to them originating in class society and private property. Racism as we know it today wouldn't exist if not for slavery and colonialism, each of which are based on class oppression. The ideology of white supremacy and the racism it entails emerged after the facts of slavery and colonialism as the justifying superstructural ideology for the abhorrent acts occurring at the economic base. The relation between enslaved person and quote, master, unquote. And so these relations of production at the economic base led to the socially constructed identity in the superstructure known as race. Therefore, it's not incorrect to claim that white supremacy and racism are a result of class society. Likewise, as has been described earlier, patriarchy was a product of the development of private property in class society. The patriarchal ideology, which holds cis women and queers as subordinate, lesser identities in the social superstructure, emerged from exploitative relations of production or class relations in the economic base. This historical materialist analysis doesn't quite square with the analysis of class presented by intersectionality. According to intersectionality, class is simply another superstructural identity, an independent vector of oppression which will overlap with other independent vectors of oppression. The struggle against class oppression in this framework is limited to struggling against class discrimination or, quote, classism, unquote. You shouldn't call people rednecks because that's classist. And that may be true, but focusing solely on the surface level superstructural instances of discrimination is like putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. It doesn't actually solve the problem of the economic exploitation of the working class by the capitalist class, the way in which the bourgeoisie appropriates the surplus value generated by the proletariat through the system of wage labor. In other words, the foundation of the entire capitalist system. What it does instead is makes the system of exploitation and oppression appear a bit more inclusive and caring than it really is by taking off the edge with some kinder words and more pleasant gestures. Using a similar analogy before of 8 cishet white men holding as much wealth as the poorest 50% of the world, the intersectional feminist solution to this problem would be that these 8 people should be a diverse mix of genders, races, abilities, religions, nationalities, and so on, and that these 8 extremely diverse, ultra-rich people should no longer be allowed to make mean classist jokes about everyone else. Which I suppose is a small step towards the actual solution? Maybe? Ish? But for people like me, we don't want a more inclusive version of the same exploitative and oppressive system where 8 people can hold as much wealth as the poorest 50% of the world. We want that system of inequality dismantled in its entirety, and a genuine egalitarian system put in its place. In other words, a socialist system.
So where does this all leave us then? Thus far, we've been engaging primarily in critique of the feminist movement and its shortcomings. We hope to have clarified some of these errors by looking at an overview of the history of the anti-patriarchal movement, then providing a historical materialist analysis of the true basis of patriarchal oppression as a result of the emergence of private property and the establishment of class society. And from there, we proceeded to look at some of the major shortcomings of the most prominent trends within bourgeois and petty-bourgeois feminist ideology. The only thing left for us to do now is to put forward our own proposed alternative for a path forward that's genuinely capable of abolishing patriarchal oppression once and for all. And indeed, the abolition of all oppression and exploitation of the working classes and oppressed masses of the world. This can only be achieved through the abolition of class society and the private property upon which it's based. Meaning this anti-patriarchal movement must be rooted within the workers' movement, not without. This is the only possible solution. A proletarian anti-patriarchal movement that's truly radical in the sense of getting to the root of the problem. Not just in form like the reactionary radfems, but also genuinely radical in essence.
For us, we refer to this as truly proletarian feminism, the standpoint of the working class in the movement against patriarchy, and the standpoint of cis-women and queer people in the workers' movement to abolish class society. Some may argue that the term proletarian feminism is unnecessary, as feminism has traditionally been a bourgeois and petty-bourgeois movement, that we should instead simply talk about, quote, the women question, unquote, within Marxism. Condescending language about this or that question aside, the term proletarian feminism simply refers to form, not essence, or content. The content that we refer to when we at Marxism Today use this term is the struggle for the liberation of cis women and queer people, gays, lesbians, trans women, trans men, non-binary people, and so on, from the patriarchal oppression of class society within the broader workers' movement. Others may be more comfortable just calling this scientific socialism with a correct position on women and queer liberation, and that's fine. A rose by any other name would smell just as sweet. Obsessing over whether we should call it this or we should call it that is falling into the trap of formalism, placing primary emphasis on form rather than the essence or content, judging the book by its cover and not by what's written within it.
But, I hear you say, feminism has always been a bourgeois and petty-bourgeois movement. How could it ever be anything but that? Well, socialism too, in its pre-Marxist formulations, referred to bourgeois idealist trends. Scientific socialism flipped this utopian socialism on its head, providing a materialist basis for the realization of the liberation of the working class, while retaining that which was positive and progressive in the previous bourgeois experiments. Likewise, republicanism is internationally understood as a bourgeois ideology, but James Connolly turns this on its head here in Ireland with socialist republicanism, which combined scientific socialism with the revolutionary anti-colonial movement of Irish republicanism, and today represents the strongest ideological force of working class revolutionaries in this country. Proletarian feminism is no different, rupturing from bourgeois and petty-bourgeois feminist trends specifically along class lines, abandoning idealist, metaphysical, bioessentialist illusions, and instead founding itself upon the historical materialist, scientific worldview which understands that there can be no complete liberation from patriarchal oppression without the abolition of class society itself. So we at Marxism Today choose to refer to this specifically working class movement against patriarchy as proletarian feminism. And for us, this necessitates certain non-negotiable points of unity.
Proletarian feminism is an umbrella category which combines the struggles for liberation for both cis women and queer people from the patriarchal oppression and exploitation inherent to class society. Patriarchal oppression can only be defeated through the abolition of private property and class society, once and for all casting off the shackles of slave society, feudalism, and capitalism, confining them to the dustbins of history. While we criticize petty-bourgeois intersectional feminism's shortcomings, we recognize that it's correct that the various modes of oppression identified in this trend do indeed intersect and have real, tangible, negative effects upon the working class and oppressed masses. Therefore, intersectional analysis necessarily exists within the historical materialist analysis of class society's development. With that said, appropriate attention must be given not only to the societal superstructure, as in the case of intersectional feminists, but also to the material relations of production at society's economic base. The resolution of exploitative relations of production at the economic base will not come about from minor legalistic reforms around discrimination and inclusiveness, though these are welcomed as part of the daily demands of the working class and oppressed masses, but instead, ending this class exploitation at the economic base requires nothing short of revolutionizing the mode of production from capitalism to the socialist mode of production. In opposition to bourgeois and petty-bourgeois feminists, anti-capitalism must at all times remain integral to proletarian feminism.
Rejecting idealist, mechanical materialist, biological essentialist, and other anti-dialectical materialist conceptions of gender and sex found in bourgeois and petty-bourgeois feminism, proletarian feminism resolutely stands for the complete liberation of not only cis-women, but also equally queers. Within the category of queers, proletarian feminism fully recognises transgender women as women and transgender men as men. As dialectical materialists, we understand that through struggle, phenomena can become their opposites. The material becomes ideal, the ideal becomes material. Mao Zedong ridiculed self-proclaimed Marxists who were unable to comprehend that matter can be transformed into consciousness and consciousness into matter, although such leaps are phenomena of everyday life. It's therefore necessary to educate our comrades in the dialectical materialist theory of knowledge. And as Karl Marx explained, theory, the ideal, becomes a material force as soon as it's gripped the masses. In other words, when someone has a thought, there's a material basis for this thought. The thought doesn't just appear from nowhere, plucked from the heavens. And then, when this person puts that thought into action in the real world, their thought, the ideal, becomes a material force. The process of transitioning functions accordingly. Through struggle in various forms, through the process of transitioning, secondary sexual characteristics can be transformed, as well sometimes as certain aspects of primary sexual characteristics. And through this struggle of transition, one materially becomes the targeted gender. The ideal is transformed into the material. Proletarian feminism stands firmly opposed to patriarchy and all who uphold it. This includes opposing not only patriarchal cis men, but also cis women and queers who, in false consciousness and against their own long-term interests, uphold the system of patriarchy. For example, Hillary Clinton may be a cis woman who calls herself a feminist, but in practice she upholds the capitalist imperialist patriarchal world order that exploits cis women and queers of the working class and oppressed masses all around the world. Hillary Clinton is a class enemy of all proletarian feminists, as are all who sit or attempt to sit in the driving seat of the patriarchal system, themselves becoming the enforcers of patriarchal oppression and exploitation. Following on from that, proletarian feminism must recognise the international dimensions of patriarchal oppression and exploitation around the world, particularly when it comes to the global sex trade and how it exploits to the most extreme degrees cis women and queers in the global south with sex tourism, human trafficking, and other hyper-oppressive practices. This necessitates within proletarian feminism a comprehensively anti-imperialist world outlook that unwaveringly supports the national liberation of oppressed peoples in the world's colonies and semi-colonies, as well as those of the internal colonies within imperialist state territories.
Now, these are by no means comprehensive, nor are they the final word. These are just a small number of basic proposals for a general proletarian feminist program, though of course the particularities of any such programs will be dictated by the specific social and national characteristics that activists find themselves moving within. So with these proposed points of unity, what does this mean in practice when it comes to organizing? Should there be proletarian feminist groups in and of themselves taking up points of unity like these? In short, yes. There should be proletarian feminist mass organizations which unite the proletarian cis-women struggle and the proletarian queer struggle against patriarchal oppression. And there are. These proletarian feminist mass organizations should function independently, but as part of the larger international workers' movement to end class society. In other words, these proletarian feminist mass organizations should be in one way or another connected to scientific socialist parties, or at very least pre-party formations, be that within a triangular structure, concentric construction, or alternative forms of organizing within broader united fronts. Examples of these kinds of proletarian anti-patriarchal mass organizations with certain connections to scientific socialist parties exist all over the world right now, demonstrating that this can successfully work in practice. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching. This is a contested topic within the workers' movement, so it's important to understand that we're putting forward our position on this matter as part of the line struggle within the international socialist movement, and why we uphold proletarian feminism. This is certainly not the final word on the matter, but we hope this will help advance the conversation in one way or another.
This video wouldn't have been possible without the fantastic patient support of everyone on Patreon. So we extend an extra special thanks to all of yous for your incredible contributions. Thank you to the legendary Jess, Christian Nepales, Rock Gardist, Jason Schmidt, Julia Affentranger, Blue Collar Red, BJB7, The Class Traitor, Wakar Khan, Jorio4, Christiander, Andrew Smith, Michael Oxlong, Citizen Smith, The Leninist Lawyer, James Bennett, Engels Beard, Jackson Lenkovich, Sleevey Nix, Borkzilla, Andrew Fisher, Joe Boy Forever, Geef, and Neox. Gurmila Magwiv, agus Slangafol.
Buenas tardes, noches y mañanas, casamas. Adiós y shalom.